Login accepted.
Hello everyone, welcome to day 2 of Devoxx. I hope that everyone had their morning coffee. So we can start, but before we start, I just want to mention that it will be live coding. So if you want to see anything, I would suggest sitting closer or on the right because of TVs. Okay, so a bit about me first. I'm Patryk Piechaczek. I'm software engineer at Global Logic and I work here for 3 years. So as you can see, I'm also a Kotlin enthusiast, and probably each of you, I'm a fan of clean code, and I'm a lover of debugging and tinkering in code. So this is the reason for the presentation. So probably each of you works with Spring, so please raise your hand. Who works with Spring? Yeah. And probably most of you know the rules that we should remember when we're working with transactional or annotation. Yeah, for example, that annotation will not work when we call it from the same bin on from the private method. But probably not all of you knows why it happens, and we will try to find an answer for this question. So I divided my code to steps, and everything is on GitHub repository. I will put link later, but you can of course scan it now. So let's start. I will not bore you with theory, so we will just work with our code. So now I just prepare my application. It's without framework. I have step 1. We have company DAO. It should be repository, doesn't matter. I don't have any entity manager or something like this. I just put logger to let us know that something is created. And here we have company service. But we want to create, what is important, we will work on new framework from scratch. Yes, something like Spring. So I want to put a new feature to my code. So I want to add a transaction. So here I have 2 methods in company service imp: create company and update company. So I hope that everyone knows how transactional works. At the beginning, we begin transaction, do something, and on the end commit. And if something is wrong, we should roll back transaction. So I don't like this code because, as you can see, we have a duplication. So maybe we can do it better. And to do it better, we can use proxy. So I mentioned that we will not talk about theory, but we can use proxy to easily do something before method and do something after method. So it's really great example for transactional, yeah? So at the beginning, we begin transaction, on the end, commit transaction. But which one should we use? If we're talking about Spring, we're thinking about Dynamic Proxy or siglib. So first one is great because we don't need to anything to our project, in my case to Maven, but everything is in JDK. What is important, it works on an interface basis. So probably you saw a lot of classes are like my service imp, because interface is required. And it creates like $proxy classes. We have the other approach to do this using siglib. So it's external library. It's based on a class extension. It's important because it will not work on the final methods. Because if you work on the class extension, we need to override something, but we cannot do it with final. It's a little faster than Dynamic Proxy, and it creates my classes like enhancer by Spring siglib. Okay, but which one should we use for our framework? So yeah, I'm here. So this is a core technology, Spring documentation, and we can see that Spring AOP defaults to using standard JDK dynamic proxies. So we will use also the same JDK dynamic proxy. But if we don't have interface, we should use siglib. But to be honest, I'm not sure that it's true. So I created the other application, just Spring application. So as you can see, we have application context. And now I'm going to debug this code. So according to the code documentation, we should have dynamic proxy, so we should have proxy class. But there is enhancer by Spring siglib, and we have interface for it. So someone is lying us. No, it's true that Spring uses by default JDK dynamic proxy. But here we are working on Spring Boot with version 2, and they decide to change its default value to siglib. We can, of course, change it using application properties. And now you can see that we will have proxy class. So we call this create company from proxy. Okay, and why they decide to change it? Because of to prevent nasty proxy issue. What is this proxy issue? So when we go to our code, and for example, we try to inject not company DAO, which is interface, but just specific implementation, we will have error message, yeah? Because as I mentioned, dynamic proxy, so it's interface, so we should inject interface. Yeah, and there is error message that we can do this. So that's why they decide to change it. Okay, so we know which one should we use, so let's back to our code. I'm going to copy and paste everything from this step. Not here, but here. Let's rename the step name. Step to A. And how we can create a proxy? As I mentioned, it's in JDK. So we can just use proxy class. And there is a method like new proxy instance. So let's go to this method, and I can see 3 parameters here. First is class loader. So it's super easy because we can take it from our main, like this class, and get class loader. The second one is array of class. So let's create this class with, not like this, class with interface. So I want to create a company service, so maybe I can do it now. Company service, and put it here. Okay, and the last parameter, I think it's the most important, is invocation handler. So it's something that will handle our, in our case, transaction. So let's create it, new proxy handler. And here I need to put what should be handled. So in my case, it should be just company service imp. And I need to create it using this. Okay, so let's move this function to create company here. Remove parameters, import from this package, and should be a company service service. I don't have company service. Yeah, I have it. Class. And back to the next parameter. Yeah, like this. Okay, so now we need to create a new proxy handler. And this is our class, yeah? So let's create it. New proxy handler, but I want to create it in my new package like framework. Okay, so I'm going to remove this constructor and create just object that should be handled. Object to handle. Let's add it to constructor. Like this. And now we need to implement one method, invoke. So if we just want to create a proxy and just call exactly the same method, we should just use method, invoke, and on this object to handle with parameters that we put to, in our case, create company. So now when we back to code, we can run it. Not this one, application, this step. Yeah, and you can see that new proxy instance just return object, so we also need to cast it. Okay, so let's run this code. Yeah, and it works. Yeah, but we created this proxy for some reason. So now I'm going to move everything what is related to transactional from this company service imp to my proxy handler. So let's copy this part, go to proxy handler, and now I'm going to create logger like this. And here, instead of just method invoke, I'm going to copy almost from the update company and change the part that is important for create company. Yeah? So this part. as I mentioned, if we want to just call this method, we should use method invoke object to handle with arguments. So it should be our result, like this, and we should return this result. Okay, and here we can just throw exception and remove this company, update company method. Yeah, so what we just did, we invoke method from this proxy, because now it's proxy, and first we call begin transaction, call this method, so create company, commit transaction, and return result. So finally, we can remove this part that is responsible for transaction, and we can test our program. Okay. And as you can see, we still begin transaction, but we don't have duplication. Everything is in our proxy handler. Okay, so I mentioned that we can also do almost exactly the same using CGLib. We don't have time for it, but I just want to show you how to do this. We need to create an enhancer class, put superclass, and as you can see, there is no interface, so interface is not required. We have proxy method interceptor. It's almost the same like our proxy handler. We begin transaction, but what is important, we invoke super method, yeah? Because we work on an extended class, so it should be override, yeah? So here we need to just invoke super. If we call invoke, we will have infinity recurrention, yeah? Because we will be there one more time. And I want to call this main method. And as you can see, there is exactly the same begin transaction and so on. But what if I change the create company to final? Like this. So I don't have transaction here. Why? Because we work on the specific class, and this method should be overridden by our proxy handler. Yeah. In interface, we don't have this problem, but here, yes. So that's why we cannot use final keyword if you're working with CGLib, and we want to use, for example, transactional. Okay. So let's go to next step. I think it's the hardest one. So now you know how to create a proxy, but I don't like to, Spring doesn't like to create a new classes using new keyword. Yeah, we will create something like application context. So let's change the name for this step. And I just want to show you what is our plan. So I want to create a proxy, application context, and just create a one method getBean, yeah, with this interface. So let's do it. Go to main, and I want to create application context. Context. We don't have this class yet. And I want to create this application context, but only for my package, yeah? So step 3 up, class, and get package. Do we have something like this? Yeah. Okay. And now, finally, we can create a company service. But I want to create it using this application context. So getBean, exactly the same name. And I want to create this bean using company service and class. So finally, we can run code create company. Okay. So let's create this application context, but not in application, but framework package. Okay, let's back, add constructor, package, root package. And we should store somewhere our components beans. So let's create private final set of class, like this, and I'm going to call it component beans. Okay, but how we can find our beans? Exactly like in Spring. So let's go to our framework package, create a new package like annotation. And in Spring, we have something like component. Yeah, so let's create component. Of course, in Spring, we have also service, repository, and so on. But let's just focus only on this one. And first target should be maybe type. And we will use this annotation on runtime. Great. But we need to have also one more annotation like auto-wired. And here, somehow we can be even better than Spring, because probably all of you knows that we should use auto-wire on constructor. So let's do it. So now we don't allow user to put auto-wired on field or setter. So let's back to our application context. And in constructor, I'm going to use a reflection class. It's from external library. And let's put this package. But it's super helpful. So let's use this reflection to store our bean, component beans. We have really great method here, get type annotated with. That means that from this package, we take all classes that has annotation component. Okay, let's import like this. And I'm going to add stream and filter this component. And it shouldn't be interface, because we want to create an implementation of this class. So let's add component is interface. And finally, we can collect to set. OK, so we have constructor. So let's back to our main, and we have get bean method. So let's create this public method. I will use generic type. Like this. Here we can also add generic and just class. Okay, so first of all, we need to add validation that this class shouldn't be interface. Should be interface. So if it's not interface, because we work on dynamic proxy and it works on interfaces, we should throw exception. New framework exception. I don't have this one yet, so we can create it in framework. And let's add message and add it to super. Super. Like this. And I'm also going to create the second constructor. I will use it later, just for throwable. OK. And the last one, I'm going to change it to runtime exception. OK, so let's back to our application context and add some error message. We don't want to care about it yet. And OK, so we have class, but first to get bean, we need to find specific implementation. OK, so let's add class T and implementation, because now we have just interface. Find implementation from this one. So let's create this class. OK, how we can find it? So we have component beans here, yeah? So we can use it. So let's use stream and try to find filter. I'm going to use component. And I'm going to look if this component get interface. I'm going to use contain, so we don't have it because it's array, so I will wrap it here. Import class. So finally, I can use contains. So if this component has this interface, that's OK. And just collect to set, and I'm going to put it to implementations. OK, but what if we have more than 2 implementations, like here? Yeah, there is a Spring application. Now, in company service imp, we try to inject company DAO, but we don't know which one should we use. Of course, in Spring, we can use qualifier, but let's keep it simple. So throw exception if something is wrong. If we have more implementation, we don't know which one should we use. So size and throw new framework exception with some message. OK, if not, we can just use it. Implementation return implementation stream and find first. But if we don't have it, we should throw exception. New framework exception. There is no bin for class, and let's add the class name. Get name. Okay, so finally we have this class. So I'm going to cast it. It's not required. It should be. Okay. And let's suppress this warning. Okay, so we have implementation. So finally we can just return and create this bin because we know what should be created. Create bin. So let's add this implementation here and create a method create bin. So what is required to create new instance? Of course, constructor. So let's do it. Not like this. Constructor. And another method find constructor. From this implementation. Like this. And I want to remove this typo. Import class find constructor. Okay, makes sense. So now we can take all constructors. We have something like this, constructors. Yeah. And I'm going to use generic type. We need to cast it. And it's exactly like in Spring, yeah? If we have only one constructor, so if constructors length is equal 1, we should return it, yeah? So auto-wired is not required for constructor. If we have only one constructor, auto-wired it's not required. So return constructor, so exactly the same what we have in Spring. But if we have more than one, for example, we should take this one that contains filter, constructor, and there is annotated present. Yeah, so we should take this one with annotation. Auto-wired class, and let's import class like this, and to set. I'm going to const with auto-wired. Okay, but what if we have more constructors with more auto-wired? So we should throw exception, yeah? If constructor size is equal than 1, greater than 1, we should throw new framework exception. We saw error message. If not, finally we can return this constructor stream find first. Yeah, find first, or through exception, like new framework exception with something is wrong. Okay, so we have constructor, but we also need parameters. So let's class with object, object params. So find params. We need constructor to find params. It seems really hard step, but it's difficult step, but it's super easy. Why? Because we can find all parameters type. Yeah, so for example, get parameters types. So if you want to create a company service, we need to put company DAO. So this is the parameter type. Okay, and if we have this company DAO, we need to have the specific implementation, specific instance. How we can do this? So let's map this parameter to specific instance. Yeah? So in our case, param, even better, we can use method that we have already. Yeah, get bin, because we need to cast this class to specific bin. So we have this method. We have a recursion here, get bin, and the final to array. Okay, so finally we have everything to create our bin. So we can just use this constructor, new instance, with parameters. And this is our bin. And I'm going to return it and cast it. Like this, or we don't need casting here, sorry, but we should just wrap it using try catch. And there is something like exception. So I'm going to use my framework exception to throw it. New framework exception with this one. But if we throw framework exception, we shouldn't wrap it one more time, yeah? So let's do something like this. Okay. I hope that everything, there is some exception here. Yeah. Error message. So let's run this code. And something is wrong, but we will see. Yeah, there is no bin for class. Yeah, it's true, because here we forgot about putting component. Here, exactly the same. We can put auto-wired, but it's not required because we have only one constructor. And we need to put in component DAO impl. So let's run it. Yeah, and we finally created application context. So now I don't need to create a component service using new, but just like in Spring, get bin component service. But as you can see, we don't have transaction here. So now we need to merge two steps, 3 and 2. So let's copy to step 4. And I'm going to rename the name for step 4. So now I'm going to go to step 2, where we have this proxy. This is how we create a proxy. And I'm going to create a proxy in my application context. So not in get bin, yeah, create. So let's edit, new proxy. This should be returned, turn, cast it to T. And what we need, a class loader. So let's take the application context. Interface, we don't have interface, but we can just put it. Class interface item. So this is interface, so we can add it to this method. It's not a problem for us. So we have interface, and proxy handler should care about this bin. Okay, so looks okay. Let's run our code. So now we have an application context that uses proxy. So we have transaction, but as you can see, we have begin transaction. Why? Because now all methods use proxy handler. So here we have component service, but it also called DAO, and component DAO is also begin transaction. So what we can do, exactly like in Spring, let's create a new annotation transactional. And we should add target to method. And in our component service, I want to support transaction only for this one, yeah? So let's add transactional here. Okay, like this. So let's back to application context for the moment. I want to be sure that I import everything from right package, yeah, like this. And in my proxy handler, I don't want to always begin transaction, yeah? So let's extract it to new method, like handle in transaction. Okay, makes sense. But what should be handled? So let's add new function like is transactional. Of course, this method should be transactional. If yes, if it's true, we should handle in transaction. If not, I'm going also extract this method to just calculate the result. Extract method, result. We should call this calculate result. So if we call it, if it's transactional, so we need to create it. It's not super easy because at the beginning I thought that I should do something like method is annotation present. If annotation present transactional, that is transactional. So it's not exactly true, because we're using dynamic proxy, so it's interface. So here we look at the method from interface, but here we don't have transactional. So there is tricky one, because we need to take this object to handle, get class, get method with the same method name, and with the same method parameter. And finally, we can use is annotation present. So now we are looking on company service impl. Okay, we need to catch this exception, so it's something is wrong. Let's return false, so it's not transactional. Okay, so it's transactional, handling transaction, and calculate result if we don't have transactional. So now I expect that we will have only one begin transaction. So let's back to our step 4 and run code. Yeah, so only this one method is transactional. So I'm going to show you one case that I'm going to copy almost everything and create company in transaction. So I'm going to refactor this code, yeah? So now this method should call create company should create company in transaction. And I don't want to have this method transactional, but only this one, yeah? So from main we call create company. This one called create company in transaction. We have transactional, so everything should be okay. So we will see. So we don't have this information. So as you know, we cannot call transactional method in Spring because from the same bin. Why? We will see. So let's add some breakpoints here, 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 and maybe here, and at the beginning. So let's debug it. And here we can see that create company is called from company service. What is company service? It's proxy. So it goes through proxy. We created proxy, and it should be handled in proxy handler. So let's move forward. Yeah, it's right. We are in proxy handler, and there is transactional. Create company is not transactional, so we go to calculate result. Move forward and find. I forgot to put this one. Okay, so one more time because it's important part. And here we call create company in transaction from this. So we can put even this. And this is just company service impl. It's not proxy. So that's why we directly go to create company in transaction. I saw something like there is a workaround. Yes, so we can of course self it. We can use self. So private final, for example. Maybe not final, but just company service impl and self. Yeah, and if we use auto-wired here, like in Spring, and call it instead of this, it will work, yeah, because we will call this create company in transaction from a bin that should go through proxy. But I would not recommend it this way. It's not the best approach. Okay, so that's why we cannot use transactional from the call it from the same bin and from the private method. Okay, so let's remove this self, and finally we can go to the next step. So the transactional, it was just example. We can do a lot of things. Yeah, for example, let's imagine that business required creating a token for our company. So let's change the step name as always to 5. We move forward, and here in company service impl, I'm going to add method. It should be override public string and generate token. And we should generate token for specific company. And now I'm going to generate token using UUID. But let's imagine that it requires a lot of steps, a lot of efforts from external API or something like this. So business decide that we can use exactly the same token if we call it from exactly the same company. So we can use cache. So we can use, like in Spring, annotation cacheable. So let's create it. And we should add it to not application, but framework, and to annotation. Okay, so it should be like transactional, so runtime and on method. So we can add it. And in our proxy handler, we need to create almost exactly the same method like is transactional, but for cacheable. So cacheable, and look if it's transactional. But first, we need to create a new map that will store our cached bin. So first, we need to have a key. So key should be just list of method and arguments. So list of some object. And return should be a specific instance, yeah? So like this. And let's call it cache map. And we can init concurrent hash map because we can use it in multi-threads. Okay. Import like this. So at the beginning, I'm going to check if method is not transactional but cacheable from this method. And if so, we need to first look at the key. So let's create list of object and our key. And we will have method like create key, cache key. And we should do this using method, because if we call exactly the same method with exactly the same arguments, we should have the same key. So let's keep it simple and just return list of methods with arguments. So maybe it should be also stream to list. Okay, so we have our key, and it's super easy. If this cache map at the beginning contains key, we should return it. Return cache map get this key. Okay. If not, we should ignore this fact and go to is transactional, if it's transactional, or calculate result. But in calculate result, we should have almost the same, because on the end, we should just add it to cache. Okay, so it's our result. And if is cacheable, we should add this result to our map. So cache map, put using this key, and I want to add this result. Okay, so I hope that we have everything. So finally, we can test our application. So let's not create company, but generate token. But I'm going to have only one instance of this new company. So let's extract it to company. And we have logger? No. So let's add logger. And here, let's log info. And I'm going to look what is our token. But let's call it 2 times. Yeah? So I expect that we will have the same result, because we put to the same method the same argument. Okay, so let's run this code. And as you can see, we have exactly the same result. Yeah? Why? Because we go to proxy. For the second method, we go to is cacheable and just take the result from the not here, from the map. Okay, so we can go to the almost last step. In Spring, when we call method getBin 2 times, we expect that we receive the same bin. So I'm talking about something like this. So getBin2. So this one and this one is the same, because the default scope is singleton. So we can do it, yeah? So let's go to step, change the name, 6, and here I'm going to create a new enum with scope. Oh, not like this. Scope enum with singleton and prototype. So now we are using prototype, so we always create a new instance. But now in our application context, first maybe let's go to the component and add scope here. So scope, and default value should be singleton, like in Spring. Singleton. So finally we can go to our application context, create a new map. That map should store a class with bin and specific instance, so object. So singleton bins. Exactly the same, we can create a new map. Let's import. And here it's easier than for cache, because when we go to the get bin, we can take this class, get annotation. We have this information in component annotation. So let's take it. Annotation. So if this annotation has scope like singleton, we should just return our result. So let's take the information from singleton bins. We will use a different approach here, so not just get contains and so on, but just compute if absent. So let's take this result from map, but if we don't have it, we should calculate it. How we should calculate it? Exactly the same. So let's create bin. Like this, but we need to go here. Okay. So I hope that everything should be okay. And yeah, we need to cast it to T. Yeah. So let's back to step 6. And finally, I'm going to create a new service. And I'm going to compare it. Yes, so it should be the same. And let's wrap it. We don't need this company. So I expect that I will have true, because company service should be equals to, oh, null pointer exception. Great, annotation scope from component. So what is invoke, because annotation is null. Well, annotation is null. I'm put company service and company service. Okay, sorry, I should put it not from class, but from implementation, I think. Okay, so let's test it one more time, because our implementation has component. Yeah, and it's true. So that's why, and that's how we implemented a singleton bin. So let's back to step 6. And here we have just component service, and we can even put logger with, sorry, not logger, but breakpoint. And we can see that company service is the same. Yeah, 1387. But we can, of course, easily change it. Yeah, so let's back to component service, and change the scope. So now scope should be prototype. Yeah, what we have previously. So let's run the application, and I expect that I will have false, because it shouldn't be the same. Okay, the last step is just refactoring. So I moved everything what was related to transactional handler. So here I have execute with transaction. So I just use functional interface like supplier, because our transactional handler shouldn't care how we calculate the result. So just take it, begin transaction, calculate result, commit, and the end. Almost exactly the same for cache. We have two methods, create key and take result or calculate it. Yeah. So if we call from the same method arguments, we should return it. And I have abstract proxy handler, and just one method is supported. So if transactional or if it's cacheable. So now my proxy invocation handler looks like this. So first we look at the cache, is supported. If so, take result or calculate. If not, is transactional, is supported. If yes, we should handle it using transaction. And almost that's all. So let's go to our main. So what we just did, in 50 minutes, we created our own framework like Spring. So we have application context, we support transactional, we support cacheable. Of course, we can add a lot of annotation, like, I don't know, secure that at the beginning we should throw exception if user doesn't have privilege or something like this. And we implemented scopes, exactly the same what we have in Spring. So by default is singleton. I think that's all. So please don't remove Spring from your project. It was just an education project. We had less than 1 hour to create it. But I would recommend to go to my GitHub repository and just I describe everything step by step, because there was a lot of code. We had less than 1 hour to create something that was developed, I don't know, by 20 years with 100 developers. So that's all. Thank you. I don't know that we have time for questions, but I will be there if you have some questions. Thank you.